I still remember the sound before I remember the argument. It wasn't somebody yelling. It wasn't a slammed door. It wasn't even the wind. It was the quiet humming beneath my boots, the low, steady vibration from the heated stone path I'd built with my own hands the previous fall. Funny how something designed to keep an old neighbor from slipping on ice somehow became the first domino in a fight that would unravel an entire community. Looking back now, I honestly believe if I had just left that walkway buried under snow, none of what happened afterward would have ever come to light. My name is Ethan Brooks, and for nearly 12 years I'd lived on a small horse ranch just outside a mountain neighborhood called Pine Hollow Estates. Calling it part of the neighborhood wasn't exactly right. My property had been there decades before the subdivision ever existed. Their fancy entrance sign, neat rows of matching mailboxes, and perfectly trimmed decorative fences all stopped about half a mile from my front gate. I paid my own taxes, maintained my own road, fixed my own fences, and preferred it that way. Most folks in Pine Hollow were decent people. We'd wave if we crossed paths at the feed store, borrow a trailer once in a while, maybe help push somebody's truck out of a ditch after a snowstorm. I wasn't antisocial. I just liked peace more than meetings. The only person I really saw every week was my 80-year-old neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn Parker. She lived alone in the little farmhouse across the road after her husband passed away years earlier. Every morning, rain, shine, or blizzard, she'd shuffle down to her mailbox wrapped in 3 scarves and a purple winter coat that made her look like a walking blanket. One icy morning 2 winters earlier, she'd slipped hard enough to crack her wrist. She laughed about it afterward, but I never forgot the sound of her hitting frozen concrete. That's why I built the heated walkway. Nothing fancy. Just heating cables, insulation, a couple of moisture sensors, and enough electrical know-how from my old construction days to make sure it worked without burning the place down. It wasn't about showing off. It wasn't about increasing property value. It was simply because I'd rather spend a weekend pouring concrete than attend somebody's funeral wishing I'd done something sooner. That winter, the system worked beautifully. Snow landed, melted, disappeared. Ice never had a chance. The morning everything changed, a blizzard had rolled through overnight, burying nearly everything under fresh powder. Trees bent under the weight. Fence posts disappeared. My horses refused to leave the shelter, which, honestly, made them smarter than most people I'd meet that day. I was standing on my porch with a mug of coffee watching steam disappear into the freezing air when I noticed someone climbing the hill toward my property. At first I thought maybe it was a delivery driver who'd made a wrong turn. Then I saw the clipboard. You ever notice how certain people can carry a clipboard like it's a weapon? This woman certainly could. Bright white parka. Designer snow boots that looked expensive enough to hate mud. Perfect hair somehow surviving 40-mile-an-hour wind gusts. Even from a distance I recognized her. Vanessa Holloway, president of the Pine Hollow Homeowners Association. We'd spoken exactly twice in 12 years. Once at a county zoning meeting where she introduced herself without asking my name, and once at a charity fundraiser where she spent 15 minutes explaining why every mailbox in the subdivision had to match the exact shade of black approved by the architectural committee. I'd left both conversations wondering how anyone found enough energy to care that much about other people's property. She didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't even pretend to be friendly. She marched straight up my driveway, slipped twice on the untreated gravel, finally stepped onto my heated walkway, stopped dead in her tracks, and stared at the warm stone beneath her boots like she'd discovered radioactive waste. "Mr. Brooks," she called before she was even close enough for a normal conversation. "We need to discuss an immediate compliance issue." I took another sip of coffee. "Morning to you too." She ignored that. "This exterior heating installation violates neighborhood architectural standards." I looked around behind me, pretending to search for another person. "You talking to me?" Her eyebrows pulled together. "Yes, I'm talking to you." "That's strange," I said. "Last time I checked, I didn't live in your neighborhood." That landed about as well as you'd expect. She pulled several papers from her folder and held them out like they were a winning poker hand. "Visual impact extends beyond subdivision boundaries. Therefore, your property is subject to community appearance regulations." I actually laughed, not because I was trying to be rude. It just caught me completely off guard. "You serious?" "Completely. Ma'am, this ranch existed before your subdivision was a sketch on somebody's napkin. That doesn't exempt you from maintaining community standards." I looked down at the warm path stretching from my porch to the gate. "Community standards. It's a sidewalk. It's an unauthorized heated sidewalk. Still a sidewalk." Her face tightened. "You'll need to deactivate it within 24 hours. "Oh," I asked. She seemed pleased I'd asked. "Daily penalties, $500 per day until compliance is achieved." I blinked once, mostly to make sure I wasn't still half asleep. $500 per day for melting snow, for violating established standards. Just then, almost on cue, Mrs. Parker slowly opened her front door across the road, took one careful step outside, saw my clear walkway cutting through the snow, smiled, and began making her way toward her mailbox without slipping once. I nodded in her direction. "See that?" Vanessa barely looked. "What about it?" "That's why I built it. Intent doesn't override regulations." Mrs. Parker reached the mailbox safely, waved at me with one mitten, then headed back home. I watched until she disappeared inside before looking back at Vanessa. "You know," I said quietly, "I'd rather explain to a judge why I kept an old woman from falling than explain to her family why I shut it off because somebody didn't like warm concrete." For the first time, I saw something flicker across Vanessa's face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't embarrassment. It looked more like urgency. Like she needed this walkway gone for a reason she wasn't saying out loud. She thrust the violation notice toward me again. "This is your final warning before enforcement begins." "Funny," I replied. "Feels more like your first mistake." She stared at me for several seconds without speaking, then turned sharply and started back toward the road. Halfway down the driveway, she stopped, glanced over her shoulder, and looked not at me, but at the equipment shed sitting behind my barn. Just for a second. Most people would have missed it. I didn't. Then she climbed into her SUV and disappeared into the blowing snow. I stood there longer than I should have, coffee growing cold in my hand, replaying that single glance over and over in my head. It wasn't the look of someone worried about property values. It was the look of someone making sure something stayed hidden. And at that moment, though I couldn't have explained why, I stopped thinking about a ridiculous HOA violation and started wondering what exactly was so important behind my old equipment shed the rest of that afternoon. I couldn't shake the image of Vanessa glancing toward my equipment shed. It wasn't a casual look. It wasn't curiosity. It was the kind of look contractors give a foundation after they hear something crack beneath the floor. I finished feeding the horses, repaired a loose fence latch that had frozen solid overnight, and tried convincing myself I was reading too much into it. That's the thing about living alone for years. Sometimes your mind invents mysteries simply because nobody's around to tell you you're overthinking things. But by sunset, I wasn't convinced I was imagining anything. Around 5 o'clock my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed my attorney, Daniel Mercer. We'd worked together years ago over a boundary dispute involving an old logging easement. Sharp guy. Didn't waste words. "Ethan," he said without even saying hello, "tell me you haven't responded to the HOA, haven't even touched the paperwork." Good, because I just spent 20 minutes reading their governing documents. And, unless somebody rewrote state law while I was eating lunch, they don't have jurisdiction over your ranch. I leaned against the kitchen counter. That's what I figured. There's something else. His voice slowed. Their violation notice cites a section that doesn't exist. Meaning someone either made a clerical mistake, he paused just long enough for me to hear him sigh, or someone created language they hoped you'd never question. That settled like a stone in my stomach. Why would they do that over a heated walkway? That's the question you should be asking. Before we hung up, Daniel gave me one piece of advice that stayed with me. Don't argue, don't threaten. Just document everything. People who lie early usually lie bigger later. That night the snow kept falling. Around 9, I stepped outside to make sure the backup generator had enough fuel in case the power lines came down. The ranch was silent except for the wind pushing through the pines. Then I noticed tire tracks, fresh ones. They hadn't been there earlier. They didn't come up to the house. They curved around the side pasture and stopped near the tree line behind the equipment shed before turning back toward the county road. I grabbed my flashlight and walked over. Whoever had been there hadn't gotten out long enough to leave footprints, at least not obvious ones. But the snow near the fence looked disturbed, almost like somebody had stood there looking through the trees. My dogs, Rusty and Boone, wandered over beside me, both unusually alert. Boone gave a low growl toward the woods before relaxing again. Dogs don't care about lawsuits. They care about instincts. His reaction bothered me more than the tire tracks did. The next morning started with another surprise. Mrs. Evelyn Parker knocked on my front door carrying 2 blueberry muffins wrapped in aluminum foil. "Thought you might skip breakfast after yesterday," she said. I smiled. "You always know when something's wrong." "Honey, half the valley knows something's wrong." That caught my attention. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "Folks are talking." Apparently Vanessa had sent an email to everyone inside Pine Hollow claiming I had installed unauthorized industrial equipment that could reduce surrounding property values and create environmental concerns. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the muffins. "Industrial equipment," Mrs. Parker shrugged. People hear official-sounding words and stop asking questions. Did anyone actually believe her? Some did. She looked away for a moment. Some didn't. Before leaving, she rested a hand on my arm. "Just be careful, Ethan. People get strange when they're scared." Around noon, I decided to take Daniel's advice and start documenting everything. I photographed the walkway, the electrical controls, the property markers, even the old survey pins my grandfather had installed decades earlier. While walking behind the equipment shed, I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. One section of the ground stayed oddly free of snow, not completely bare, just thinner than everywhere else. At first I assumed heat from buried electrical conduit was causing it, but my conduit ran in the opposite direction. Curious, I knelt down and brushed away the remaining snow with my glove. The soil underneath wasn't frozen. It was damp. Warm enough that steam barely drifted into the cold air. That's strange. I walked back to the shed and grabbed a steel probing rod I normally used for locating irrigation lines. Slowly I pushed it into the ground. 4 inches, 8 inches, then, clink, metal, not rock, definitely metal. I tried another spot, same thing, parallel. Whatever it was stretched underneath the ground in a straight line toward the woods behind my property. I stood there staring for several seconds. My ranch was over 70 years old. Old farms collect forgotten things, abandoned pipes, rusted fencing, telephone cable nobody remembers installing. It could have been anything, still. Vanessa's glance toward the shed suddenly felt less random. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of an engine climbing the driveway. This time it wasn't Vanessa. It was a silver pickup I'd never seen before. A man in his late 50s stepped out wearing a heavy canvas jacket and carrying a county utility badge. "Afternoon," he called. "You Ethan Brooks?" "Depends who's asking," he chuckled. "Name's Frank Dawson, County Water Department." That got my attention fast. "Water Department, mind if I ask you a few questions?" We stood near the gate while he looked over a folded map. "We've been updating some historical infrastructure records. Your property's one of the oldest in the valley." "That's true. Ever notice any abandoned utility lines?" My heartbeat slowed just enough for me to answer carefully. "Depends what kind," he smiled. "Fair answer." He unfolded the map across the hood of his truck. Most of it showed property boundaries, creeks, and old service roads. Then he pointed to a faded blue line ending abruptly near my equipment shed. "That's the interesting part," he said. "According to records from the early 70s, there used to be a municipal emergency water line crossing somewhere around here. Used to be. Supposedly abandoned 40 years ago." I looked toward the shed again. "Supposedly," Frank scratched his beard. "Funny thing about paperwork. Sometimes records say one thing while the ground says another." Before I could ask another question, his radio crackled. Someone needed him across the valley for a frozen main break. He folded the map, climbed back into the truck, then rolled down his window one last time. "If you happen to notice anything unusual under there," he nodded toward my property, "give me a call before you dig." Then he drove away. I stood alone in the driveway, watching the truck disappear around the bend. First, an HOA president invents regulations to force me to shut down a harmless walkway. Then my attorney discovers the violation is built on language that doesn't legally exist. Then somebody circles my property in the middle of the night. And now, the county casually mentions forgotten utility lines ending exactly where Vanessa had been staring. Maybe none of it was connected. Maybe I was building a mystery out of coincidence. But deep down, I already knew something had changed. This wasn't about concrete. It wasn't about snow. And it definitely wasn't about neighborhood appearance. Whatever was buried beneath that patch of warm ground had been forgotten by almost everyone, except someone who suddenly seemed desperate to make sure I never started asking questions. And for the first time since this whole ridiculous fight began, I found myself wondering whether the safest thing I could do was exactly the opposite of walking away. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed the same handful of moments like scenes from a movie that refused to end. Vanessa standing on my walkway with that forced confidence. Daniel telling me the HOA had cited rules that didn't exist. The strange tire tracks behind the shed. Frank's old map ending almost exactly where my steel rod had struck metal beneath the frozen ground. None of those things proved anything on their own, but together they felt like puzzle pieces scattered across a table, each one pointing toward a picture I still couldn't quite see. By sunrise, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to start digging with a backhoe or accuse anyone of anything. I was going to do the one thing people trying to hide the truth usually hate the most. I was going to ask questions. Frank answered his phone on the second ring. "County Water Department. It's Ethan Brooks. I had a feeling I'd be hearing from you." We agreed to meet later that morning. When he arrived, he wasn't alone. He brought an older survey technician named Louise, a woman who looked like she'd spent 40 years solving problems without ever raising her voice. She carried a ground scanner that rolled across the soil like an oversized lawn mower. "We're not excavating," she explained, "just taking a look underground. We started behind the equipment shed where the snow had melted faster than everywhere else." The scanner moved slowly across the ground while a small monitor displayed faint colored lines beneath the surface. After only a few minutes, Louise stopped walking, She looked at the screen, then looked at Frank. "Well," she muttered, "that's interesting." Frank leaned closer. "How many?" "At least 2 large utility lines." My stomach tightened. "Abandoned." Louise didn't answer immediately. Instead, she adjusted a few settings before running the scanner across the same area again. This time the image became clearer. 2 large pipes extended beneath my property before turning toward the direction of Pine Hollow Estates. She frowned. "If these records are accurate," she tapped the monitor, "they shouldn't even be here." Frank slowly folded his arms. "Looks like somebody forgot to update more than paperwork." We spent another hour comparing old county maps with modern property records. The more pages Louise spread across the hood of her truck, the stranger everything became. One easement had been legally terminated decades ago. Another showed infrastructure scheduled for removal that apparently never disappeared. Nothing directly implicated anyone, but one thing became increasingly obvious. Whatever ran beneath my ranch wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Frank finally looked at me. "You know what's bothering me?" "What's that?" "If these lines were truly abandoned," he glanced toward the subdivision, "why would anyone care whether you installed a heated walkway?" That was exactly the question I couldn't stop asking myself. Before leaving, Frank gave me a business card with his personal number written on the back. "If anybody starts asking unusual questions about your property, call me." "You think that'll happen?" He offered a tired smile. "I've worked county utilities for 28 years. People don't get nervous over old pipes unless those pipes still matter." The answer came sooner than either of us expected. That evening, just after sunset, headlights swept across my barn windows. A black SUV rolled slowly into my driveway and stopped 20 feet from the porch. I recognized the vehicle immediately. Vanessa stepped out alone. No clipboard this time, no official folder, just a heavy winter coat and an expression that looked strangely exhausted. "Mind if we talk?" she asked. I stayed on the porch. "Depends. HOA business," she hesitated. "Not exactly." I motioned toward the cleared walkway. "Well, since you're already benefiting from my terrible architectural decision, you might as well come up." For the first time since I'd met her, she actually smiled, although it disappeared almost immediately. We stood in silence for several seconds before she finally spoke. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be." Interesting choice of words. "The walkway isn't the issue anymore." I figured as much. She looked past me toward the equipment shed again. There it was. That same glance, that same nervous pause. "Mr. Brooks," she said quietly, "some things are better left alone." I folded my arms. "You know, most people trying to convince me not to look at something usually make the mistake of telling me not to look," she sighed. "You think you're uncovering corruption." "Am I?" She didn't answer. Instead, she looked down at the warm stone beneath her boots. "Communities survive because people choose stability over conflict. Communities survive because people trust each other," I replied. "Those aren't always the same thing." Her shoulders dropped ever so slightly. For a brief moment, she didn't look like an HOA president. She looked like someone carrying a burden she never expected to inherit. "There are decisions," she said softly, "that were made long before either of us lived here." "Then why are you trying so hard to protect them?" She looked up, and for the first time I noticed genuine fear in her eyes. Not fear of losing authority, fear of consequences. "Because once certain doors open," she whispered, "they never close again." She turned before I could respond, walked back to her SUV and drove away without another word. I stood there listening to the fading sound of her engine until it disappeared beyond the trees. The conversation had answered almost nothing, yet somehow confirmed everything. She hadn't denied there was something beneath my land. She hadn't defended the violation notice. She hadn't even mentioned property values. Instead, she'd ask me, in her own indirect way, to stop asking questions. That alone told me I was finally asking the right ones. The next morning, I called Daniel and explained everything Frank had found, everything Louise had scanned, and every word Vanessa had said. There was a long silence before he finally replied, "Ethan, yeah, do not touch those utility lines. Wasn't planning to. Good." Because if they're connected to active infrastructure, this just became bigger than a neighborhood dispute. I stared out the kitchen window toward the equipment shed where fresh snow had once again begun melting faster than the rest of the yard. Daniel continued, "Whatever this is, let the county handle it. If someone knowingly concealed infrastructure or altered public records, there are agencies equipped to investigate. Your job now is simple, which is, keep documenting. Stay patient. Let the truth come to you instead of chasing it." I wish I could tell you that's where the story ended, that the county immediately uncovered every answer, that everyone responsible admitted what they'd done, and that justice arrived neatly wrapped in a courtroom verdict. Real life almost never works that way. Sometimes the biggest victory isn't exposing every secret. Sometimes it's refusing to be intimidated when someone with power expects you to stop asking honest questions. As for what was really hidden beneath my ranch, let's just say the county investigation that followed lasted months, not days, and by the time it was over, Pine Hollow Estates looked very different from the community I'd known for the previous decade. But that's a story for another day. Until then, I want to hear from you. If you were in my position, would you have kept digging for answers? Or would you have taken Vanessa's advice and walked away before opening a door that could change an entire community? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this rarely have simple heroes or simple villains. And sometimes the hardest decision isn't finding the truth. It's deciding whether you're willing to live with what happens after you do. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who believes that asking honest questions should never be considered a crime.